When I try to kick him, I just put halfway his feet in my face. And then stop there by pose.
He was standing close enough to feel the wind off the kick before it stopped, a hair's breadth from his nose. That single moment, more than 50 years old now, still comes up whenever Sammo Hung talks about the man who changed his life. At 72 years old, one of the last living links to the golden age of Hong Kong martial arts cinema, has been speaking more openly than ever about his friendship, his rivalry, and his admiration for Bruce Lee. Before we get into those stories, it's worth understanding the man telling them, because Sammo Hung's own journey is just as remarkable as the legend he helped build. Sammo Hung Cambo was born on January 7th, 1952, in Hong Kong, into a family that had film running through its veins. His grandmother, Chin Tisayang, was a celebrated actress who appeared in dozens of films during the early days of Chinese cinema, and his grandfather, Hung Chung-ho, worked as a director. With his parents occupied by their own demanding careers, it was his grandparents who largely raised him, and it was through them that Hung absorbed his first lessons about the industry that would define his life. At just 9 years old, Hung was enrolled at the China Drama Academy, a Peking opera school known for its brutal training regimen. Students rose before sunrise, trained for hours in acrobatics, weapons, and combat forms, and lived under a strict hierarchy enforced by their master, Yu Jim Yuan. As was customary, students took on their teacher's surname while enrolled, so young Hung became known as Yuan Lung. He quickly rose to become the eldest and most capable member of a performing troupe called the Seven Little Fortunes, a group whose alumni would go on to reshape Hong Kong action cinema. Among his fellow students was a smaller, mischievous boy named Yuan Lo, the future Jackie Chan. The two developed what has often been described as a friendly rivalry, each pushing the other to work harder, a dynamic that would follow them for decades. Life at the academy was unforgiving. Hung has spoken in later interviews about the exhaustion, the discipline, and the injuries that came with the territory. As a teenager, he suffered a serious leg injury during training that kept him bedridden for an extended stretch, unable to exercise the way he once had. He gained a significant amount of weight during his recovery, a change that would end up shaping the types of roles offered to him once his film career began. Rather than the traditional leading man parts, Hung often found himself cast as villains, tough guys, or comic figures, a reality that could have discouraged a lesser performer, but instead it forced him to develop a physical comedy and choreography style that became uniquely his own. By the time he was 14, Hung had already begun working professionally, taking a job as an assistant to action director Han Ing-chi on a King Hu production. Over the following years, he worked his way up to the ranks of Hong Kong studio system, extra, stuntman, fight coordinator, building a reputation as one of the most skilled and reliable action men in the business. It was in the early 1970s, on the set of a Hong Kong production, that Hung's path first crossed with Bruce Lee's. Lee had returned to Hong Kong from the United States and was quickly becoming the biggest name in the local film industry. And Hung, by then an experienced stunt performer, found himself working alongside him. Their professional relationship deepened when Hung was cast in Enter the Dragon, released in 1973, playing the Shaolin student who faces Lee's character in the film's opening sequence, a duel now considered one of the most iconic openings in martial arts cinema history. Hung has recalled that early period with a mixture of awe and amusement. In more recent interviews, he's told a story that has become one of his most repeated anecdotes. Curious about Lee's reputation for blinding speed, Hung asked him directly whether the stories were true. Lee didn't answer with words. He answered with a kick that stopped just short of Hung's face before he had time to react. Hung has described the moment as genuinely eye-opening, an instant education in just how fast and precise Lee's movements really were. It wasn't a hostile exchange. If anything, it cemented a mutual respect between two men who had come up through very different paths. Hung through the grueling opera school system, Lee through street fighting, Wing Chun training, and years of independent study abroad, yet had arrived at the same conclusion about what it took to be a true martial artist. Working on Enter the Dragon gave Hung a front row seat to Lee's process. He has spoken about Lee's intense professionalism, his insistence on precision in every strike, and his refusal to let a scene move forward until it looked and felt exactly right. For a stunt performer who had spent his whole life inside rigid training systems, watching Lee break away from tradition and build his own philosophy of combat left a lasting impression. Hung has said that some of what he learned about choreography, timing, and the visual storytelling of fight scene traces directly back to those days on set. Lee's sudden death on July 20th, 1973, at just 32 years old, sent shockwaves to the entire industry, and Hung has never shied away from describing how deeply it affected him personally. He's spoken about the sense of disbelief that swept through the Hong Kong film community, the feeling that someone who had seemed larger than life could simply be gone. For Hung, the loss wasn't just professional. It was a loss of someone he considered a genuine influence on his own development as a performer and, in his words, something close to a hero. In the years since, Hung has occasionally reflected on what might have been had Lee lived. The two were part of a small circle of performers actively reshaping how martial arts looked on screen, and Hung has suggested that their creative paths might well have crossed again in bigger ways had Lee's life not been cut short. Instead, Hung found himself, alongside other members of Lee's circle, helping to complete unfinished business, including contributing choreography work to the eventual completion of Game of Death, the film Lee had been working on before he died. Even now, decades later, Hung describes Bruce Lee's influence as something that never really faded. He has said that the principles Lee stood for, discipline, innovation, and a refusal to be boxed in by tradition, are values he has tried to carry through his own decades of work as an actor, director, and action choreographer. While his connection to Bruce Lee remains one of the most talked about chapters of his career, Sammo Hung's own filmography stands on its own as one of the most influential in Hong Kong cinema. His directorial debut, The Iron-Fisted Monk, arrived in 1977 and immediately signaled his willingness to blend serious martial arts choreography with comedic timing, a combination that would define much of his output over the following decade. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Hung became one of the most bankable names in the industry, both in front of and behind the camera. Films like Encounters of the Spooky Kind, The Prodigal Son, and Magnificent Butcher showcase his range as a director capable of mixing horror, drama, and slapstick with genuinely inventive fight choreography. His collaborations with Jackie Chan and Yuen Biao, the trio often referred to as the Three Dragons, produced some of the most beloved action films of the era, including Project A and Wheels on Meals, pictures that combine death-defying stunt work with a level of humor rarely seen in the genre before. Behind the scenes, Hung was equally influential. He founded production companies that gave opportunities to countless performers, choreographers, and directors who would go on to shape the industry for years afterward. His contributions to action choreography, the way he blocked fights, used a camera, and built tension through comedic timing, helped define what audiences around the world now recognize as the classic Hong Kong action style. Success in the entertainment business rarely moves in a straight line, and Hung's career has had its share of difficult stretches. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, as Jackie Chan's international fame grew exponentially, some of Hung's own projects struggled to find audiences, and tensions between the two lifelong friends occasionally surfaced. Financial pressures mounted as well. Several of his own productions underperformed, and the loss of a long-standing partnership with a major studio forced him to rethink his position within an industry that was rapidly changing around him. Rather than step away, Hung adapted. He shifted more of his energy toward action choreography and mentorship, working behind the scenes to train a new generation of performers even as his own on-screen opportunities became less frequent. That period of reinvention eventually paid off. In the late 1990s, Hung found a fresh audience in the United States through the television series Martial Law, which introduced him to Western viewers as a leading man for the first time in his career. Though the show's run was relatively short, it opened doors that kept his career moving forward into the new millennium. The 2000s and 2010s brought a genuine resurgence. His work as action choreographer on the Ip Man films, beginning in 2008, introduced his choreography to an entirely new generation of martial arts fans and re-established him as one of the genre's essential figures. He returned to the director's chair after nearly 2 decades with The Bodyguard in 2016 and continued to take on prominent acting roles in films like Call of Heroes and God of War, proving that his screen presence and physical skill had lost none of their power. In 2010, the New York Asian Film Festival honored him with a Lifetime Achievement Award, a recognition of a career that, by that point, had already spanned 5 decades. Behind the public triumphs, Hung has been canned about the personal cost of a life spent almost entirely on film sets. His first marriage, to Jo Uenoke, began in 1973 and produced 4 children, Timmy, Jimmy, Sammy, and Stephanie, before ending in divorce after more than 2 decades together, a separation that coincided with one of the more turbulent professional stretches of his career. He later married Joyce Cadenzi, a former Miss Hong Kong, who transitioned from modeling into acting, first working alongside Hung on the 1987 film Eastern Condors. The two married in 1995 and have remained together since. Hung has openly expressed regret over the long hours and extended absences that came with running productions, acknowledging that his relationships with his children suffered because of how consumed he was by his work during their formative years. His son, Timmy Hung, followed him into the industry, becoming an actor and martial artist in his own right, which added a layer of both pride and complexity to their relationship as father and son navigated similar professional worlds. Health has also played a significant role in shaping the later chapters of his life. In 2009, while filming Ip Man 2, Hung fell seriously ill and underwent emergency heart surgery, a health scare tied in part to years of physical strain and lifestyle habits built up over a lifetime in the industry. The experience prompted him to reassess both his physical well-being and his priorities, though it did little to slow his output. He returned to work remarkably quickly and has continued acting and choreographing well into his 70s. To understand why Hung's memories carry so much weight, it helps to remember just how unlikely Bruce Lee's own rise really was. Born Lee Jun-fan on November 27, 1940, in San Francisco, Lee was the son of a Cantonese opera performer and grew up shuttling between 2 cultures, American by birth, Hong Kong by upbringing. He appeared in his first film role as an infant and worked steadily as a child actor throughout the 1940s and 1950s, but his teenage years in Hong Kong were marked by turbulence. Feeling like an outsider because of his mixed heritage and frequently targeted by bullies, Lee found himself drawn into street fights and, eventually, a fight so serious it drew police involvement. His parents, hoping a change of environment might set him straight, sent him to the United States in 1959 with instructions to make something of himself. It was in Seattle, while working odd jobs and studying philosophy at the University of Washington, that Lee began formally teaching what he had learned of Wing Chun under his teacher Yip Man back in Hong Kong. He opened his first martial arts school in 1964 and is teaching philosophy, favoring adaptability and practical self-defense over rigid traditional forms, put him at odds with more conservative elements of the martial arts community. That tension came to a head in a now-famous private challenge match against a rival martial artist, a fight whose outcome pushed Lee toward developing what would eventually become Jeet Kune Do, his own hybrid approach to combat that borrowed freely from boxing, fencing, and other disciplines. Lee's transition into Hollywood came with real obstacles. Racial stereotyping limited the roles offered to him, and he watched the starring role he had hoped for go to another actor entirely. Rather than wait for the industry to change its mind, Lee took matters into his own hands, forming a production company with Raymond Chow in the early 1970s, and using it to create the films that would define his legacy, Way of the Dragon, with its legendary showdown against Chuck Norris, and finally Enter the Dragon, a landmark U.S. Hong Kong co-production released in 1973. His death that same year, attributed to a severe reaction to medication that led to cerebral swelling, cut short a career that had only just begun to reach its full potential on a global stage. What makes Hung's recollection so compelling isn't just the anecdotes themselves, but the perspective of someone who watched Lee up close during the years that mattered most. Not as a distant fan, but as a fellow performer who trained under similarly demanding conditions and understood exactly what it took to move the way Lee moved. When Hung talked about that near-miss kick or about Lee's obsessive attention to detail on set, he's not repeating second-hand legend. He was there, now in his 70s. Hung remains one of the few people alive who can speak firsthand about Bruce Lee the collaborator and colleague, rather than Bruce Lee the myth. His willingness to keep sharing those memories, the respect, the rivalry, the grief that followed Lee's death, has given fans a rare, grounded window into a friendship that helped shape 2 of the most influential careers in martial arts cinema history. And through his own decades of work as an actor, director, and choreographer, Hung has made sure that the principles he once watched Lee embody, discipline, innovation, and a refusal to be confined by